Hello, everyone. My name is Wendee Lee Curtis, and I will be your host and moderator today for today's amazing event. We are connecting with Dr. Crystal N. Fleming. She is an award-winning sociologist and the writer of Rise Up, How You Can Join the Fight Against White Supremacy. This urgent book explores the roots of racism and its legacy in modern day, all while empowering young people with actionable ways they can help to foster a better world and become anti-racist. Dr. Fleming completed her PhD at Harvard University and publishes scholarly research on racial oppression and anti-racism. She is also the author of an academic book on race and white supremacy in France, as well as the critically acclaimed How to Be Less Stupid About Race on Racism, White Supremacy, and the Racial Divide, a book that Publishers Weekly called an insightful and an irreverent text, truly accessible. Dr. Fleming breaks down complex concepts and constructs arguments effectively in jocular, witty prose. Her work also appears in Newsweek, The Root, and Huffington Post, just to name a few. Now, with the release of her new book, Rise Up, Dr. Fleming breaks down the origins of racial injustice and its continued impact today, connecting dots between the past and the present by including contemporary examples ripped from the headlines and actionable ways that young people can help to create a more inclusive world. She shares the knowledge and values that unite all anti-racists: compassion, solidarity, respect, and courage in the face of adversity. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Crystal M. Fleming.
Thank you, Wendee. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you and the students who are joining us. I'm just also really grateful for, you're taking the time to support this book, and everyone that's going to tune in. I look forward to also hearing from you. You all can holler at me on social media. I'm always the self on Twitter, just to give a shout out to my social media.
We love the Bird app. We absolutely love the Bird app. Every hair is standing up on my arm. So we had talked previously before a little bit about racism, and I'd made the analogy that racism is a bit like glitter, right? No matter how much you work on it or you try to heal it or fix it, there's just always some remnants of it. So anyone who's ever spent a holiday season where glitter was involved in anything, you sweep and you clean and you think you've gotten up every vestige of glitter. And then somewhere in the middle of the summer, you're walking around barefooted and there it is on the bottom of your foot. So as a mother of a biracial daughter, my daughter is half Black and half Jewish, we have conversations around these topics all the time. So reading this book was so prescient and so deeply personal for me and my little family too. So I personally wanted to take a moment and thank you personally for writing this pivotal, important work.
That means a lot to me, Wendee. Thank you so much for sharing that. And when we talked before, you shared more about your daughter's, perspective as well. And, I think I would love for Rise Up to be a book that families read together. Obviously it could be a classroom resource, but I think it hopefully will open up some interesting conversations with parents and children, even if they're grown children, and just really folks of all ages.
So typically when we talk about racism, it usually centers around the adult response to it, adult dialogue. I'm really curious to know, what was the genesis of your decision to write Rise Up? And why did you choose to speak to this age demographic?
Well, I think you used a word earlier, urgent, or the urgency of this moment. And I, for sure, as a scholar and an educator in recent years, I felt an urgency to write beyond academia. So I do write academic scholarship, publishing in scholarly journals and the like. But it's also really important to me as just a member of our society who's concerned about justice, to make sure that my work reaches beyond the ivory tower and hopefully is useful to people of a wide variety of backgrounds in terms of supporting anti-racist education, mobilization, and constructive change. So for sure, when I wrote Rise Up, that was a part of, my broader efforts as a public sociologist and as a Black woman, as a Black queer woman who, again, wants to take a lot of the knowledge that I've acquired in my own studies and in my own research and try to make it accessible to lots of different kinds of people, including young people. And so when my literary agent and the publisher came to me with this idea of writing a book about the history and sociology of white supremacy that could empower young people with concrete ideas for promoting constructive change, I was really honored to be in that position, and I felt called again to do this work in a way that could be accessible and hopefully impactful. So for me, it's really all about trying to bring the knowledge of groups and communities that have been historically marginalized and excluded from our curricula, bring that knowledge to as many people as possible in a way that can be empowering.
See, I thought it was so impactful that you chose this demographic, because one of the conversations that's bandied about quite a bit in our household is how disempowered my daughter and her generation feel. They really feel like they've been left with all of the missteps of our generation, Gen X and the boomers, and that they really don't have, that their values aren't reflected in the world that they live in, that they're, in short, being given short shrift right now. Mm-hmm. So I love that you're speaking to this group in concrete, tangible ways, not some feel the moon, feel the stars.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is important, because I think the fact of the matter is, if young people don't feel empowered, if they don't see themselves as change agents, then that's really convenient for the people that hold power. That's really convenient for the status quo, because people in power don't want typically young people to really understand how powerful they are, because they want to hold on to power. Yeah. And so I think it's important to kind of start with and kind of level set our understanding that young people are powerful. And that's part of what I try to bring to bear in Rise Up, where yes, we're going to, encounter and learn about historic figures and some of the icons of anti-racist mobilization and activism. And we're going to see how some of those same people were pretty young when they got involved in challenging white supremacy, including some people today, young folks today, who are doing anti-racist work in their own communities. And I mean, literally like today, like they're, across the country from coast to coast. There are young people who are rising up for justice, and not just racial justice, but as I write about in Rise Up, young people are doing really important work, drawing connections between the fight against racism and the work to empower people of a wide variety of gender identities and sexual minorities, and kind of bringing an intersectional lens to social justice work. Young people are doing important work in that arena as well. So if there's anything you take away from this book and from our conversation that we're having now, I hope it's that acknowledgement that young people have a lot of power, and in working together, especially in coming together and forming solidarity around our values and around the need to build the kind of world you wish to see. There's power in numbers as well. So I think I hope at least that the book allows for young people to see themselves as change agents.
So the last time in our lifetime, in our awareness, that I remember youth having this sort of impact was in the 60s during the civil rights movement, right? So that's the only lived experience I have. But when you talk about, I feel the wellspring of power that these young people hold. if we could just keep the cynicism at bay.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, I can be cynical too. I mean, I know what it's like to feel. I mean, I am a millennial. I think they call us elder millennials. I'm turning 40. I'm turning 40 this month. But I remember what it was like to be even younger than I am now, and really feeling like, well, how can we, improve society when we have so many problems? And I had a really powerful encounter with an abolitionist organizer, and I write about her in Rise Up. So some of the students who are going to join us in a bit probably already saw her name, but Mariam Kaba. And Mariam Kaba is an educator and organizer, and she's well known for many things, including her recent book on abolition, which is called "We Do This Till We Free Us." It's a great book. But she's also known for this quote, which is that hope is a discipline. Hope is a discipline. And I've had a chance to meet her a few times over the years and to learn from her. And when I was feeling disempowered and disenchanted and cynical some years ago, she reminded me, she was like, well, Crystal, you're an educator, so you have to be. There's something about the experience of teaching and working with young people that has to be something in that gives you hope. And she was right. It's true. I learned so much from my students, who are often, though not always, younger than me. So we do have non-traditionally aged students in college.
Yes.
But also, I just think it's important to understand right now, and I know we're going to talk about this as well, we're living through a really overt backlash to anti-racist education. And part of what's driving that backlash is the knowledge that people in power have, that what we teach and what we learn and what young people are learning matters. It matters because I think the reality is, when we provide tools for people of all ages, including younger people, when we provide tools for folks to see themselves as change agents and to be inspired by stories of those who challenged systems of oppression and made gains, that is going to create more positive change. It's happening. That's something that upsets folks who would like to maintain the status quo, but that's to be expected. And I'm excited that there are so many young people from coast to coast and really globally who are not allowing that backlash to prevent them from doing the work that they want to see happen to build the world they'd like to see.
Yes, and a lot of them are young women, which is even more inspiring to me. To your point, this actually dovetails beautifully. I'm glad you brought up Miriam. At the beginning of your book, at the very beginning, you write about the discomfort of learning about racism. You spoke a moment ago about the backlash around, dissolving these mythologies that we've all been raised with. I was really struck by how you chose to balance the discussion about the ills of white supremacy alongside the assertions of you call them long, honorable traditions of white anti-racism. Why did you choose to include that call to action? And can you expound a bit on the contributions of white abolitionists? I'm not sure that that's as prevalent in the zeitgeist, in the conversation around racism. And I love that you included it.
Well, it's an interesting question. And there's a bunch going on here. And I would love, when we open up with the students, I'd love to hear the students' perspectives. But first of all, I do try to make it clear in my writing, but also, when I give talks, that if we're going to be discussing atrocities and violence and injustice, all of which is part of racism, then that's going to make people uncomfortable. Certainly people who are disadvantaged by racism are uncomfortable with it. And as you learn about the ways in which people have been and still are harmed by practices and policies that uphold white supremacy, that I think as a human being, that should make you uncomfortable. We should be uncomfortable with collective suffering, even if it's a form of suffering that we haven't personally experienced or that we think we haven't experienced. So I think there's a level of discomfort that is inherent in learning about violence. And I think it's important to understand racism is violent. It's a system of oppression that has been imposed and maintained through violence and coercion and indoctrination. Teaching people that certain racial groups are superior to others. Like, that has been the norm for generations. And so I think part of what we're seeing now in the backlash to anti-racist education is this myth that young people, and especially white youth, are not able to learn about our country's history of racism without feeling bad about themselves, or without sort of thinking that, being white means being a bad person. That's a myth for several reasons. One of which, and this connects to part of your question, Wendee, some of the folks who have been challenging white supremacy for generations have included white Americans. And I'm just focusing on the United States for now, although racism is global, and my work as a sociologist is also about racism globally. But just to stick with the US for a while, there's been a minority, but an important minority, nevertheless, of white Americans who challenged slavery, and not just who challenged slavery, but who challenged ideas of white superiority. There were white activists in the civil rights movement, not just people who marched with Dr. King, although there were people who marched with Dr. King, of course, but people who actually put their lives on the line. Viola Liuzzo is the name of one white civil rights activist, a white woman who lost her life standing up against white supremacy. Jane Elliott is a white anti-racist educator who's in her 80s. And to this day, she has spent decades as an educator and as a anti-racist activist, challenging the myth of white superiority and educating people about the realities of racism. I think it's important to start there with that acknowledgement, again, in part to counter this myth that challenging white supremacy means being anti-white. That is absolutely untrue.
Yes.
Right. I mean, and even, I write about this in Rise Up. I write about it in How to Be Less Stupid About Race, but white educators have also been very important for me in my own learning as a student. Of course, Black educators and scholars of color have also played a really, really important role in my own awakening and in my own edification. But there have also been and still are white scholars and colleagues who are doing really important work. So, we have models of interracial solidarity.
Yes.
They already exist. It's happening every day. And that's also something that scares people who want to maintain the status quo, who don't want to see more interracial solidarity, not just against racism, but against class oppression and inequality and other axes of domination. We have lots of examples of ways in which folks have come together across difference to stand up and rise up for social justice. So I don't know if I hit on everything in your question, Wendee, but
I think it's so important because I can't think of a single person outside of perhaps academia or this field of study that could name one white abolitionist. And I think that's by design. I know that there may be people, or maybe some of our panelists may or may not know the Quaker community.
Yes.
Stood firm in their revulsion of chattel slavery.
Right.
The mythology is pervasive.
Yeah, I mean, and we could have a conversation too about white abolitionists. Just very quickly, I agree with you. One of the major problems I don't know if I could say it's one of the major problems we face, but part of our reality is exactly what you've said, Wendee. A lot of people can't name white anti-racists, like white people who have actually been involved in anti-racist activism, even though it's not new. and specifically about abolition. And there's both historical forms of abolition, like the fight against transatlantic slavery. Of course, that's what many people think of first with abolition. And then, of course, we have, ongoing abolitionist organizing and activism around incarceration, around policing. And there are white activists who are part of that as well. But just to go back to chattel slavery, transatlantic slavery, and abolition, one of the additional misunderstandings or myths that sometimes people have is that if a white person historically was fighting against slavery, that necessarily meant that they viewed Black people as equal. And unfortunately, that was not always true. When we delve into, even the complex views of someone like Abraham Lincoln, right? So instrumental, of course, in the Emancipation Proclamation and, the fight against legalized slavery. But at the same time, Lincoln was someone who viewed Black people as inferior. And so anti-Blackness, and this is a clue actually to one of the major problems we continue to face, which is that even though we had Emancipation Proclamation, we've had civil rights legislation, we still have the fight for civil rights legislation, but the idea of racial inferiority, the idea of Black people and Indigenous people and people of color being less than, that has outlived those legislative changes. And that's because we're dealing with something that's not just about our laws, it's also about our culture, the culture of racism, and this myth of, again, racial superiority and inferiority that is like the glitter you were discussing. It can be very difficult to think about how to actually eradicate that. But we can't do it without honest discussions, without honest reckoning with our history, and not just our history, but what's still happening today, right? So I just wanted to add that because it's something that sometimes gets lost in discussions about the abolition of slavery. Sometimes abolitionists were racist.
Yes. And that's a really important distinction. You mentioned Indigenous peoples, and you actually spoke at length and passionately in the book about it. For me, just personally, that the opening of the chapter where you put the lyrics to "This land is your land, this land is my land, this land was made for you and me." I remember as an elementary school student singing that with my whole heart and being very proud of that, in a very impassioned way. But after reading the book through the lens of what it is that there's just so much work to be done. Do we have enough time? Do we have time to get it all done?
Well, that's, the thing is we're part of at least the way I view it, we're part of a long process, right? We don't have to do everything on our own or even at one point in time. When we can see ourselves as part of a long line of, change agents and people who have been pushing for a more just and inclusive and compassionate society, I hope that could take a little bit of the pressure off, like we have to fix everything now. No, we have to understand that we're dealing with systems of inequality that were built over a really long period of time. If we think about modern racism, that's something that was built over the course of centuries.
Yes.
And so at the very least, we're going to have to probably, put in, and we have already been seeing generational work. So the question is, and I hope where Rise Up and other books can help support young people in these questions. The question is, how can you take your knowledge and how can you take your own experiences and perspectives and observations and channel that into constructive change right where you are, right in your community, right in your school, right in your career, whatever that ends up being? How can you connect with other people who also want to create positive and constructive change right where you are? Because that matters. You don't have to sort of have this pressure or feeling like we have to, or we even can create some kind of instant utopia. That's not realistic. But what is realistic is you looking around in your community and saying, how can I help? How can I stand up for supporting people who have been historically excluded or marginalized? And how can we raise up the voices and perspectives of Indigenous people, of Black folks, of Latinx and Asian people, of white folks who are involved in the struggle against racism and the struggle against class inequality. And sometimes even those voices are opposed by those who would rather maintain the white supremacist status quo. So that's how I view it. And I hope, again, that the book is empowering for young people in that endeavor.
So this is my last question. Discussions about critical race theory have dominated public conversations. In reference to your book, would you codify your writings and rise up as critical race theory? And if so, what would you say to people to ease their concerns, whether it's educators or parents who view critical race theory as divisive?
Well, I would say a few things. I think in any conversation about critical race theory in this moment, it's important to begin with an acknowledgement of the fact that the backlash we're seeing and the misinformation we're seeing about CRT, it's not like random. It's not just something that happened for no reason. It's a political disinformation campaign. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with about half of the states in this country, proposing legislation that's coming from one political party, legislation to attack anti-racist education and call it critical race theory. The reality is that, again, from coast to coast, we're seeing school boards where people are talking about banning books by folks like Toni Morrison, or even, books by civil rights leaders like Ruby Bridges, who, as a little Black girl, helped integrate her school against the opposition of white racists in her own community. And she's still alive and she's doing great work, and she's written books for young people. And her book being called divisive or calling for it to be banned, it's lamentable, but it's also by design because it's become a political strategy. And part of what the strategy is a response to last year's resurgence of interest in anti-racism. We had the largest mass protests around Black Lives Matter in response to the murders of George Floyd and many others, Ahmaud Arbery and others. Last year, the largest protest movement in this country's history. Lots of people buying anti-racist books, sometimes for the first time. Yes. And that's been politicized, and the backlash is to undermine that. And it's a very well-funded disinformation campaign. So I just want to begin with that acknowledgement. This is, usually headlines about CRT are not really in good faith. We're dealing with misinformation. Yes. I am a critical race sociologist, so this is not a trend for me. Critical race theory, right? Well, critical race theory is a body of work that comes out of law schools and really began to emerge in the late 70s and kind of crystallized in the late 80s. And the one thing I want to just make clear is, even today, critical race theory is a very specific kind of legal scholarship, and it's branched out into other fields. Like, I'm a sociologist, there are philosophers and all kinds of education scholars and people who work in CRT, but most of that work is at the graduate level, not even in college, but some of it's in college, but much of it is in like graduate schools. And so to answer your question about Rise Up and other books for young people, and I mentioned the work of Toni Morrison and Ruby Bridges, none of those people are critical race theorists. But any book that is challenging white supremacy or that has as its premise the idea that Black and Indigenous and people of color, that their knowledge should be included in our curricula, that is being labeled CRT, even though, you know, it's actually really difficult to take graduate level scholarship about the law and teach it to young people. And that is, you know, not what we actually are seeing in K through 12 education, but that also doesn't matter to the political disinformation campaign that's trying to call anything that's anti-racist CRT. So Rise Up, you know, insofar as it's, you know, not a book about the law and, you know, exegesis of legal theory, it by definition cannot be CRT. Is it informed by work in critical race scholarship and Black studies and Indigenous studies and ethnic studies and Black feminism and intersectionality? Yes. As I think, you know, any work that's anti-racist has a lot to learn from many of the fields I've named, but there are many different intellectual perspectives that are present in the book. CRT is just one of a number of different perspectives that have influenced me as a scholar. And I hope that bringing these different perspectives together is empowering for young readers.
You debunk the idea that this is a lazy take and that you're unequivocal that this is a targeted, specific campaign. So we have a group of panelists that are going to be joining us in just a little bit, and I cannot wait to hear their takeaways. They've read the first 3 or 4 chapters of the book. Most of them are seniors and juniors, and these young women have some really powerful thoughts and questions that they want to banty about with you. So Great. We're going to take a very short break. We will be right back with our panelists so that we can enjoy more conversations about this important and pivotal work by Dr. Crystal Fleming, Rise Up. We'll see you guys in just a little bit. Welcome back, everyone. Again, my name is Wendee Lee Curtis, and I am your host and moderator for today's panel. I've been waiting with bated breath for the last week and a half for this moment in time, and now we shall wait no more. Dr. Crystal Fleming is here with us to talk about her new revolutionary work, Rise Up, and we have assembled a panel of brilliant young minds that will be positing a number of questions to her about this work in relation to their own experience with anti-racism and white supremacy. So without further ado, let me introduce our illustrious panel. Our first guest is Maylee Henderson. She is from Robert C. Byrd High School in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Welcome, Maylee. We have 2 students from the Colorado Academy in Denver, Colorado. Our first student is Abby Allam. And our second student is Ana Yanez. Welcome, these 2 students from Colorado Academy. And last but certainly not least is Clara Page. She is a senior at the Baldwin School in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. Everyone has confirmed that their pronouns are she, her. Welcome, ladies. If you would turn on your cameras, mute your mics, and let the games begin. Hi, everybody. How are you?
Hey, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, I know you guys are juniors and seniors, and you guys have very chock-full schedules. You guys were able to listen to that last segment with Dr. Fleming and I. Any off-top thoughts about the conversation we just had from anyone who'd like to join in? Feel free. You can unmute. Maylee, you want to go first?
Sure.
You unmuted, so you have no choice. You gotta go.
Oh my goodness, I thought we were supposed to.
No, you're good.
Okay, I really enjoyed both of your thoughts about the controversy around critical race theory in schools. I personally like living in West Virginia. I think our population is like 97 point something% white.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not too many people of color in my school, but those of us that do attend Bird High, like it's really important to us that our history is taught and that we learn about ourselves and make sure history is not repeated. And we are fought against sometimes. So I really understand the controversy there. And I just think it's really important. It's an issue that I'm passionate about. So I appreciated your thoughts on it.
Maylee, I just want to ask a question, not to put you on the spot, or, I'm not asking you to speak for everything that's happening down there in your community, but since you mentioned that, teaching, history is important to you, and, having a real encounter with these issues gets backlash in your experience. I was wondering, are there though, like other white community members, white students or teachers or parents or families who are like supportive of the kind of, teaching and education that you'd like to see?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
I have recently been having meetings with the entirety of Bird High's history department. And they have been extremely receptive and extremely kind. They take many notes on what myself and my Black friends would like to have taught and how we would like to be represented. And they've been making really positive changes in our school, and I really appreciate
I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear. And I love that you're holding meetings where people are taking notes on what you have to say. So
yes, ma'am.
so ahead of the game.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we can begin with the questions. Abby, if you would unmute your mic and go ahead and posit your question to Dr. Fleming. Take it away.
All right. So one question that I was really hoping to hear you answer was, do you have any advice for students of color in predominantly white spaces? Because I know that's an experience that I've had for nearly my entire life. And I know it can be really draining and it can be really exhausting to feel like you're the only person who looks like you, where you go to school or, wherever else it may be. So yeah, I was just wondering if you had any advice for students of color.
It's my experience too. I went to the Baldwin School for high school, and before that, I was at another predominantly white school, college, graduate school at Harvard. So I hate to be so blunt, but I'm used to predominantly white environments, and often, even as a full professor or faculty member, being one of the only Black voices in the room, whether it's a faculty meeting or other kinds of spaces like that. And I'm also used to having students come to me and talk about how difficult that can be. But I was wondering for you, Abby, when you say it can be draining, what are some of the scenarios or experiences you've had that are particularly draining? And maybe I can bounce off some ideas that might be helpful.
I guess another thing was just hearing microaggressions all the time, whether they be from other students or even faculty members,
Yes.
like people confusing me with the one other person of my race, or people mispronouncing my name or touching my hair, or all kinds of things like that. So I guess those are the two main kind of things that I wanted you to talk about.
And those two sets of experiences are really important to think about, starting with microaggressions, which can actually have macro effects, right? And sometimes are really experienced in very overt ways. Just for people who might not be familiar with the term microaggressions, some of you probably have heard it before, or you've experienced it and you've called it out. But microaggressions are these like everyday slights or insults or interactions that can really weigh down on people of color, Black folks. And they often happen in these, again, everyday encounters. It can be a remark. It can be a slight, a way of interacting with someone that's demeaning or that's stigmatizing. And it's harmful. It adds up over time. It has effects on mental health, physical health. And the other issue you mentioned, Abby, this idea of feeling like when you are one of the only people in your community in a classroom or in a school, sometimes you get treated like a spokesperson or like you have to educate everyone about these issues. And so what I want to say is, number one, I feel you. I have been there. Abby, I'm still there. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in a meeting where a white person who I know didn't mean any disrespect, there were only 2 Black women in the meeting. They called me the name of the other Black professor in the meeting. So the things that you see, right, happening right now, it doesn't just disappear as we get older and we move into professional roles. And so I encourage 2 things. One, that students advocate for yourself by speaking up to school administrators to push for there to be an effort to educate by the institution, right, by your school or the school district, to educate educators about how to be a culturally competent teacher and how to be aware of things like microaggressions and how to avoid enacting these types of harm in the classroom. It's not the work or the burden of students to have to do this all the time. It's really the responsibility of institutions and schools and school districts to prepare competent faculty and teachers. And by speaking up about your experience, again, maybe there are only a few of you, but it would be great if at least another student of color could join you in advocating and just speaking up and saying, you know what, we're not paid to be diversity consultants for the school. We're students. We're here to learn. We don't want to have to deal with this. So go hire someone and deal with it. So speak up, right? Speak up as you're doing and call upon your schools to prepare their employees, right? The teachers and educators to be culturally competent in the classroom. So that would be my advice. And I wonder, Abby, is that something that has been tried yet, or and any progress made, or does it get ignored?
I think there's definitely been some progress, but I'd like to see even more progress, and I'd like to see. Well, I know that I've been really involved with my school's diversity work, as have other students of color like Anna. But I think that, you know, being even more involved would be great to see, just because I don't know, I think I know what the student experience is like at my school, and I think that I have really valuable input, but I also know that it can be really exhausting to constantly be the person that my school looks to for student advice. So I'd really like to learn more of like balancing what progress I want to see with also prioritizing my mental health.
Thank you, Abby, for saying the words mental health and for just, elaborating more on that. Because what I'm hearing, and again, this doesn't disappear as you get older. If anything, it might intensify. But what I'm hearing is this need to, set some boundaries. That's the way sometimes we talk about it. Like, what are your boundaries? And paying attention, like I meditate. Do any of you ever meditate? Have you ever tried mindfulness apps or anything? Or you're like, no, I don't meditate. That's okay. It's okay. But meditation and mindfulness are practices that sometimes can help us cultivate an awareness of how we're feeling. And so I use mindfulness if I'm in a meeting or if I'm in an encounter and I notice, I'm being asked to do something that doesn't feel appropriate, or I'm frankly tired of educating people on XYZ issue. To me, that's a signal I need to set a boundary, right? And sometimes what can help is if you have some friends who are also dealing, like you mentioned, you've been doing this work along with maybe some of the only other students of color, and you can kind of support each other in setting boundaries and saying, well, you know what, this kind of work or diversity work is actually harming me. I'm not going to do this anymore, or I will say yes to this and I'll say no to all this other stuff. But that is, I think, a lifelong process that I'm still very much in, even as I near 40, of sort of paying attention to what feels like something I have the energy to do, and saying no as a self-care and community care practice, learning to say no when you need to, precisely as we pointed out, prioritize your mental health, or just do other things like maybe your schoolwork. Right. So I hope that's helpful.
just be the emotional labor. Thank you so much, Abby. My daughter talks about that all the time, the emotional labor of having to educate those around her. So I love that you posited that question to Dr. Fleming. I was reading through some of the questions, and I would love to actually jump over to Miss Clara Page. If you would unmute your mic and posit your question to Dr. Fleming. I'd love to hear her feedback on this.
Hi, Dr. Fleming.
Hi.
Similarly to Abby, I was just wondering, you talked about the first time you really realized you were Black in one of the first few chapters. And I was wondering what advice you would give to young children or even young adults who feel singled out or called out in a room where you are the only source of diversity.
Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing I did with Abby. Clara, can you help me? I'm going to kind of play out the scenario. You're the only of your community in a classroom environment, and you're called out. In what way are you being called out? And that will help me think through what you're experiencing.
It doesn't normally happen for me in really like a classroom setting. My main sport is lacrosse. And
okay.
A very predominantly white sport. And so, you know, you can see me at a lacrosse tournament, maybe probably being one of the only source of diversity, or at a camp or at a clinic. And there was an experience one time where, you know, I just felt very singled out. You know, I was called Brownie. And it was very hard to take in, especially knowing that I was the only person of color who was there. And so I was just wondering what advice you would have for me, because, you know, I get frustrated in situations, you know, I start to cry. So in that situation, I just wanted to cry. But then I also got mad at myself because I was like, I shouldn't be crying right now. You know, I should be learning from this. I should be sticking up for myself rather than just feeling badly about myself and being called out.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to say, I'm really sorry that happened to you, because that sucks. It shouldn't have happened, and it's not an unusual experience, as you probably know, right? And you mentioned lacrosse, and thank you for, you know, again, sharing, being vulnerable and sharing this incident that happened to you. But also lacrosse, I write about it in the chapter later in the book on sports, because a lot of people don't know, while lacrosse today is very white and it's, you know, really a predominantly white sport, it started out from Indigenous people, right? The Iroquois invented lacrosse. So it's an Indigenous sport that's now been whitewashed and a site often of racism. And that's what I write about in that sports chapter. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge that your reaction, right, first of all, did you think, oh, that's racist? Like when that comment was made, or was it just like, you felt like it was negative and demeaning, but you maybe didn't attach the word racism to it?
No, it was a right away feeling. I looked at one of my best friends right away and she knew what I was feeling. And it's kind of just that point where, you know, you feel that lump in your throat and you're just like, really, does this happen? Yeah, no, I knew right away. Okay.
Well, that in and of itself is that insight that you had that this is racist. I want to applaud you in that recognition, because it's not every time that an incident like that occurs that in the moment you even know it's racism. Sometimes it's in describing a thing that happened to some, you know, your friend or family member later, then you're like, oh, in the moment you might have just felt uncomfortable, but in this example, you knew, nope, I'm upset and this is why, this is racist, this is wrong. And that recognition is powerful. But I want to go further with that, right? Because it's also common that sometimes when we experience that kind of racism and we don't expect it, right? You probably weren't expecting that to happen. You might have expected it the next time you played because it happened, but that time you might not have expected it. It's very normal when you're unexpectedly slapped in the face with racism or being denigrated to not know how to react. And you have a human reaction, and you're entitled to that. You're entitled to cry, even if you might feel embarrassed or you feel like I shouldn't be doing that. Why not? You're allowed to cry. Have you heard the term white women's tears? Okay, well, there's a phrase called white women's tears. And part of, I mean, if you look it up, people have written a lot about it, but it sounds tongue in cheek, but it's really this serious recognition that some members of our society, their pain and their tears get taken more seriously and legitimate than others. And I want to be clear, it's not every white woman whose tears are made to matter. But when we compare to the experiences of women of color and Black women and Indigenous women, our tears don't always get taken as seriously because of centuries of the intersection of racism with misogyny. So it's okay to cry. And it's okay to not know how to react when something like this happens. And so I would just hold space for some self-compassion, that it's fine, that you reacted in that way. It's understandable. It's a human reaction. But then often the question is, okay, something like that happens to you. Then also sometimes people ask, well, how do I react the next time? Or maybe you start to expect that, well, something like that might happen again. And that also is a burden to carry, because maybe you just wanted to play sports, but now you're thinking, well, this could happen. So I think I want to be honest as we continue our questions. I don't have the answers for everything. I'm trying to find these answers myself, right? But part of what's helpful is to find a way to create a community around yourself, even if it's just one or two other people, right? It could be a trusted friend. It could be a parent. It could be a coach on the team, or it maybe have to be someone outside of the team, but someone with whom you can be in community and have real talk conversations and be like, what, this happened to me. I don't know how to deal with it next time. Or when you see the person who made the comment, right? Like if you don't have anyone around you can talk to, then it's going to be a very isolating experience. And you don't want that, because it doesn't need to be, because what happened to you is happening to people every day in different places. So finding a way to stitch together a little bit of community so that you can have an outlet. You can have someone to bounce ideas off of. And it may be a matter of, maybe the team needs to have a conversation about what happened, because if you heard it, someone else heard it. And maybe it shouldn't be ignored. So part of it also depends on what would you want to see happen. Would you want there to be a more serious acknowledgement of it, or do you want to kind of move on, right? These are questions that can guide how to move forward. What would help you feel, like you're in a better place around this, so that it's not just something you internalize, because none of it is your fault.
Thank you.
That is great advice. This is not just yours to carry, right? We didn't create this issue, so it shouldn't be ours just to throw on our back and carry through life. Thank you so much, Claire.
And can I just want to say one other thing, because this is also in the sports chapter, which, Claire, if you get to it, I think you might like it. I share the stories of some youth of color who over a century ago were experiencing exactly what you talk about, these kind of racist comments. And one of the themes of that chapter is, why do people make those kinds of denigrating, insulting comments in sports? And often it's because they're afraid of you. I mean, they're literally afraid of getting beat by you. So they're looking for anything to try to undermine you, right? If you weren't a threat, they wouldn't say nothing. But it's it's juvenile, it's harmful, it's ridiculous, but it's also the goal of it is for them to win. And don't let them.
Go down swinging. Anna, if you would, please unmute your mic and go ahead and ask your question to Dr. Fleming.
My question, kind of a two-part question. How do you think that your upbringing, as you mentioned in your book, not really learning about race when you were younger, led to you wanting to engage in this work now? And I guess, why would you recommend young people begin anti-racist education at a young age as opposed to later in their lives?
Thank you for those questions. Yeah, so one of the things I try to be honest and authentic about is just what you were saying, right? That I did not grow up, having like deep conversations about racism in my family. In school, these were not issues that were often discussed explicitly, even though I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And so there started to be more conversations around diversity. But unfortunately, too often conversations about diversity are not actually spaces where structural racism and white supremacy are frankly addressed. So I try to be honest about that I had a learning process, because sometimes people see me, a Black woman professor and writer, doing research on racism, writing about these topics, and think that I was born with a Black power fist, and that's not the case. I really had to take classes with Black educators. That didn't happen until college. I didn't have any Black teachers. Frankly, I didn't have any non-white teachers, as I believe of any non-white teacher until college. So we all have a learning process, and it's ongoing. Number one. Number two, yes, as I got older and I went to college and I'm taking classes in Africana studies and sociology and political science, and I'm learning, that wow, like stuff is messed up. Like, this is bad. Like the history of oppression is just devastating. I was really upset. I was really mad. I would talk to my mom and I'd be like, how come you didn't, share with me your own experiences of growing up and living through desegregation in the South? We're from Tennessee. My family's from Tennessee. And as I got older and I started to study and work on these issues, my family began to discuss them more. And so I think it's important that people understand, of course, Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, because we are targeted in specific ways by systemic racism and white supremacy, people in our communities tend to be more knowledgeable about these issues compared to our white counterparts. But it's not the case that every household, in these communities always talks about these issues. And it is the case that no matter what your background is, we've been influenced by racist ideas, and we've been affected by racist policies and practices, whether we know it or not. So yeah, I think it was certainly the case that as I began to pursue my own edification, decide what I wanted to focus on in college and then in graduate school, I felt both an intellectual passion for better understanding these issues. And then as I got even older, I felt a passion for, again, as I was saying earlier, moving beyond universities and colleges to share with the public some of the work that's been impactful for me.
I love that answer. You're a millennial and I'm Gen X. And so just to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, my experience was slightly different. It was about how to survive white encounters and survive in white spaces. And that's because my parents were boomers, right? So they were even closer to the Jim Crow experience, that lived experience. So to hear your experience, Dr. Fleming, in my mind, even though we know that there's plenty of room for growth and improvement, is still an evolution in the right direction of that not being the center, like the central tenet of how that landed and lived in your life.
I hadn't thought about that before. You think that's a Gen X millennial difference?
I do.
I hadn't thought of that. That's interesting.
I do. It's all the conversations were around surviving experiences around white folks.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to, so surviving as opposed to what?
The idea of flourishing never,
okay.
It was keep your head down, do the work. You're probably not going to get acknowledged for it. So you have to pat yourself on the back.
Yeah.
But it was really staying out of harm's way.
I get it.
Psychologically, spiritually, morally, emotionally.
Mhm.
Because I think we all have a somewhat similar experience in that we are the only women of color in predominantly white spaces.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was just get the A and get out.
And I think, I could be wrong. I think people are starting to write. By the way, I need to ask the students, are you all Zoomers? What is the name of your generation? What are you? Are you Generation Z? What are you? Do you know?
Yeah, I think we're Gen Z.
Okay, so you're Gen Z. People are starting to write more about Gen Z. And I think one of the things I've seen, and I don't know if this resonates with the students, but Gen Z being, even more advanced than millennials in terms of centering questions of well-being and mental health and, not settling for some of what maybe prior generations felt like they had to settle for. So I think, again, young people are already doing really important, impactful work to improve our society in many different ways.
I couldn't agree more. You're speaking to the right audience, Dr. Fleming, because it's no holds barred with this generation.
Good.
No F's given. All right, Ms. Maylee, if you would unmute your mic, we would love to hear your question for Dr. Fleming.
In the introduction of Rise Up, you mentioned being accepted into the Gifted and Talented program and only noticing one other Black student. I related to that personally because I too was in the Gifted and Talented program. However, I was the only person of color in the entire countywide program. In fact, my mother was a school psychologist and she pushed for me to be tested. And without her perseverance, I would not have even been considered for testing. Even though I was accepted, I often received comments during meetings and classes such as, "You're very eloquently spoken, how surprising." And none of the white children who qualified for Gifted were met with that same surprise. So obviously I could not have been the only student of color in the entire county who could have qualified for the program. So my question is, why do you think young people of color are overlooked and underestimated so frequently? And what can we do to change that?
Thank you, Maylee, for sharing your experience. Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge part of what you've shared is that, first of all, your family, your mother had to fight for you to even get into the program. And once you were in, you still experienced, right? I don't know if you view it as a microaggression, but you're nodding. Okay, so you experience these denigrating comments and treatment, right? And I just want to pause because that's a really important point. Sometimes when people talk about diversity and inclusion, they think that just by including historically excluded groups, then we don't have any problems anymore. And the reality is, if you look at the history of whether it's desegregation or just pay attention to what's happening all around us, when you bring or you include groups that have been historically marginalized, very often you're bringing them into environments that are hostile or environments that are not culturally competent, even if the people involved are well-meaning and they don't mean to make you feel a certain way because of the preponderance of culture, right? Our history of having a racist culture and the idea of who's gifted and who's not gifted, who's intelligent, who's not intelligent. That is connected to the history of racism. And even the history of standardized tests, right? And as someone who, was admitted into the Gifted and Talented program pretty young, I think I was in the second grade. Of course, I didn't know anything about the history of standardized tests. I was just like, well, I got in. I thought, fine. The test was fine with me. I had no complaints as a kid. And it was as an adult that I learned, well, actually, standardized testing, if we look back at the history of it, not only is there a history of racist ideology and scientific racism as part of the origin of standardized tests, but it was also, these tests were used to exclude immigrants, including immigrant groups from Europe that were considered inferior to other white Europeans. So there's also the last important part about standardized tests. There's also an important class component, and not just with IQ tests, but if we look at other kinds of standardized tests that are getting attention, SATs and whatnot. And we know it just doesn't make sense that people who are wealthy are somehow more intelligent than everybody else. Just, rich people are not geniuses. That's not the way the world works. And yet we see that it is people with resources who tend to do better on these tests. And so that's a clue that, we're dealing with inequality. That's a multiple forms of inequality, class inequality, racial inequality. And we're dealing with an ongoing history, again, going back to our culture, because I'm a sociologist, I care about culture, but we have these cultural representations of what intelligence means. And we have to be honest and say, well, you know what? A lot of that is a myth, the myth that people of color, Black people or Indigenous people are not smart. It's just, that's part of the system of white supremacy, and it's not true. So I think it's important for, I think someone like me, who some would think, well, you benefited from, the Gifted and Talented program. I think it's important for people in these programs to be open and honest, like you are, about your own experience. Being included doesn't mean being protected from hostility or being protected from racism and other forms of injustice. And when we look at the history of these tests, the histories are problematic. And we need to do more to dismantle systems of inequality that prevent people of a wide variety of backgrounds from flourishing and having equal access to educational resources. So thank you for your question and for what you've shared.
I love that. My mom used to call it the racism of low expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. The racism of low expectations, and conversely, the racism of just believing that it's normal for white people and people with resources to dominate in the Gifted and Talented program. That doesn't make any sense. And so we need to challenge both of those ideas.
And even the playing field. So based off of the conversation, ladies, that we've had with Dr. Fleming today, and some of the things that you've read in those first few chapters of the book of Rise Up, I would love to hear each of you talk about at least one actionable way that you think that you can help to foster a better world and become anti-racist. Who'd like to go first? Go ahead, Claire.
I think just teaching people to embrace themselves and be confident in themselves is just a key part to making the world just a better place. That might be cliche, but I think the most important thing, you have to love yourself first in order for you to spread positive light and be able to encourage other people to love themselves. So that your first step has to be confident in yourself. Don't let anyone get you down. Then you can take that next step and help other people be able to do that.
I love that. I love that.
Same. Abby, you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I'd love to. Just like Clara was saying, I think it's really important to love yourself, but also to make sure that you're prioritizing your own mental health and really being able to use your voice while also advocating for yourself. I think knowing that you need to care about your own mental well-being and your own safety before you can actually start to advocate for others is really important. And it's something that I'm really, really trying to work on as well.
Yes, that's so important. And if I could just add to that, Abby, that as we're working to support our own mental health and well-being, also alongside with that, joining and advocating for policies that will, allow people, including people of working class and poor households, to have equal access to mental health support and services. That it shouldn't just be something that you can afford if you happen to be wealthy or if you have really great insurance. So we want to, tie self-care to community care. At least that's the way I see it.
That's an important distinction. I love that. And the essential tenet of working in and around anti-racist ideologies and thoughts and movements. Anna, I'd love to have you unmute your mic and weigh in here. What's one actionable way that you've taken from our conversation or from the book, Rise Up, regarding becoming more positive and being anti-racist?
Yeah, I think definitely just having the courage to speak up, especially when you are one of the few people in your community that has the lived experience to share with others. Obviously, like Abby was saying, know that your mental health comes first. And that's really important to know that it's not your job to be doing this, but also just acknowledging the change that you can bring with your experiences.
Yes, that's super powerful.
That.
Speaking up.
Go ahead, please. No, Dr. Fleming, please.
No, I was just saying, speaking up. It's having the courage to do that and hopefully finding examples of other people who either around you are also speaking up or, in books like Rise Up, icons who have done it, who can encourage you when you feel like there's something that you want to speak to that you might not feel confident yet in speaking to. Well, you can see that you're not the only one who's done it and be encouraged by that as you speak up.
Wonderful. And Miss Maylee, we'd love to hear your thoughts around this.
Hi. This year at Bird High, I started a school-based nonprofit called the Eye of the Dream Team. And it is basically just a way for there to be love and fellowship and brotherhood and sisterhood between people of color at my school and white allies. I feel like there's a lot of people's champions in this group. I feel like it's caused a lot of good, a lot of joy. And I just really like that we've all bonded and grown and understood each other more. I feel like knowledge is an important step in progress.
That's beautiful. And that reminds me of Dr. King's beloved community, Maylee, which is, I'm sure, an idea and a praxis that you're familiar with. But just as you've said, using knowledge, but also the practice of building solidarity, right, across different communities to, create a better society, but starting right where you are in the community you live in. So I find that so inspiring. And I'm, again, all four of you, I'm so inspired by everything you've shared and encouraged by the work you're already doing to speak up, to rise up, and to create positive change and take care of yourselves and your own well-being. So thank you for everything you've shared.
Yes, and that's something you espouse, Dr. Fleming, in your book over and over again. I have enjoyed every single moment of this. I would like to close out our panel by reading the last few lines of Dr. Fleming's book. I don't know if you guys have just the excerpt, or if you have the entire book. If you don't have the book, don't sleep on it. Get the book. The book is amazing. I had to stop a few times and reread a few things because it really is, it's game changing. And I can't wait to see what your generation does with this kind of information and the internal fortitude that you already hold. Dr. Fleming writes in her last paragraph, she writes, activist and organizer Fannie Lou Hamer famously said that nobody's free until everybody's free. So what are you waiting for? Let's rise up and find our freedom. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I've appreciated all of your contributions and your time. Dr. Fleming, is there anything you'd like to say to this illustrious panel?
Well, first, gratitude. Thank you so much again, recognizing it's a school night. Everybody's busy. I don't know even if you've had dinner yet, but thank you for setting aside time to join us and for sharing your own knowledge. And I think there was one last thing I wanted to share because a question was asked that I didn't get a chance to answer. Why read Rise Up? Or what's the role of anti-racist education today? And I just want to say that, after you finish reading those last lines, then you'll find lots and lots of footnotes or endnotes. And one of the things I try to leave young readers with, readers of all ages, are lots of resources. So there's I don't want to scare anybody, but there's 400 endnotes in this book. So there's no excuse for not knowing what to read next or having other ideas for your continuing anti-racist education. But my goal is to help support you in the work some of you are already doing, or the work some of you would like to embark upon in bringing about some of the changes you'd like to see. So once again, thank you, Wendee. Thank you to all four of our illustrious panelists, and thank you to everyone who's joined in to learn more about the book.
And we'll be keeping tabs on you. We will be following up to find out what you guys are doing moving forward. So I'm excited for all of your very bright futures. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.